Hello, my loves. We trying to figure out which day I'm on. It's day 2 and 3 of research at the RISD Museum, and I think it's days 10 and 11, maybe 11 and 12. Doesn't really matter. So I hinted on Facebook yesterday that there was some exciting things that had happened. And that is true, and I'll talk a little bit about them. I'm going to leave you a little in suspense while I'm also in suspense awaiting some test results, which we think we'll have while I'm here. I'll get to that in a second. And then, so I came home yesterday after dinner, and I was like, I am just tired from learning all this stuff. So I figured, okay, I'll lay down, I'll take a little nap. I'm not going to set an alarm because if I do just sleep through, then great, because I'm still fighting off a little bit of this sinus infection. And I don't think I have long COVID, but I definitely have some lingering fatigue effects from COVID and a cough that just won't go away. So, so I was like, I'll lay down for a little bit. It's possible I'll fall asleep. And I slept from like 6 until midnight, I think. So I got up for a couple hours last night, but it did not feel like vlogging. So this is the vlog for Tuesday and Wednesday, or day 2 and day 3 of the first week at RISD. And so to quickly recap, the first day I mostly did Indian subcontinent textiles with very few, if any, exceptions. I definitely peeked at a few of because they have most of them on either a cart or on the counter space in this. And I'll try and take some pictures so I can show you guys what this place looks like and what my working space is like. But of course I was like, I can't wait. I need to take a sneak peek look at some of these. And so I did. There's a bunch of tapa cloths from Samoa, Fiji, Hawaiian Islands, other Polynesian islands and nations. There was like a Taraz band in a glass frame that I was like, I gotta look at this. So it's really hard to have like all of this magnificence around you, and then you can only look at one thing at a time. But I'm like, all right, pull it together. Let's do this in an ordered and quasi-scientific fashion. So I had there's sort of like these interesting boxes that open like a book, and then have like one side has like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm describing this well. They're basically like boxes that open like a book, and then one side of the book has like, like where the pages would be, right? So that it seals shut, it closes. So there were 2 of those boxes, and then there was just one like tissue paper, 3 samples, tissue paper. So I've been trying to work through all these boxes and sort of loose, smaller fragments, and most of which are from 1934 acquisition from the museum, where they just bought a bunch that they believed were probably from India, were probably found in Fustat, Egypt, which is kind of like the famous place everything and everybody says stuff is from. And so I've been just trying to like get through those so that I can get that stuff out of the way and then get to some of the bigger stuff, which is more like the tapa cloths. Like these things are huge. They're on big rolls and everything. So day 2 and day 3 were primarily Indian subcontinent. So there were not a lot of surprises. There was one interesting surprise today, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And then yesterday I was like, I need to mix it up. Like I've seen Indian textiles for days, it feels like. So I need to mix it up. So I went and grabbed, well, actually I started with an Indian textile that I was like, I don't think this is Indian. I think it's something else. I'll show you. It's this one. And so it might be Indian, but the motifs are a little different than what you would expect. So I was like, all right, let's mix it up a little bit. I'll at least see something different than what I'm used to seeing. So I'm looking at it, and most of the time, and I get asked this question a lot, most of the time I usually can't tell the difference, or not readily unless I'm really focusing on it or unless there's something very dramatic about it. I can't usually tell the difference between cotton and linen under the microscope that I have because the magnification is such that it's not huge. Now, let me clarify that. There are some very obvious things, like cotton tends to be much shorter haired than, longer staple linen does. And when I say long staple, I've been asked to clarify some of these terms, so I'm going to. A long staple cotton or a long staple linen, you hear it more so with linen, is just the longer fibers that are then spun together. So if you think when you braid your hair, if your hair is all one length and you braid your hair, then from your braid you shouldn't have too many of like the little hairs sticking out of your braid, right? Now if your hair is layered, all different lengths, and you braid it, then you're gonna have all these like funky things coming out, right? Well, that's what happens when a thread is spun. You take multiple filaments of the cotton, and a filament is like the individual strand. You take multiple filaments, you spin them together, you smooth them out a little bit, sometimes like with a little bit of wax or whatever you're going to use. And then sometimes you will ply that, which means you'll take like one spun thread and another, and then you'll spin those threads around each other just for a little added strength. That is usually for sewing thread. It's not usually for weaving. So weaving is usually a single ply, so a single strand of filaments that have been spun together. So Indian subcontinent printed textiles from the Middle Ages, and I think even modernly, but I haven't seen any. I don't know why they would change, are always spun in one direction. In the field of textiles, we call them Z-spin or S-spin. And if you don't know it, it's not a big deal, but basically one is clockwise and one is counterclockwise, right? So ignore those things, just hear Z and S. So Indian subcontinent always does Z-spin. And then if they ply their threads, then they're plied usually in the opposite direction. So it's a Z-spun thread with an S ply. Conversely, in Peru and Chile and other areas around there, they always spin with an S spin. And then when they ply, they tend to ply with Z. So S spun, Z ply. So just keeping that in mind, I have yet to see any Indian subcontinent textile from this time period that has an S spin. It's always a Z spin. So that's one thing, like, yep, it's a Z spin, it's plain woven, it's got such and such width of threads. These are all consistent with the other things we're doing. And that's what I'm doing as I'm looking through each one of these textiles, as I'm visually cataloging the characteristics or elements that without doing any kind of testing, no part of the textile is ruined. We don't have to send it away for radiocarbon dating, which would be great, but that does tend to ruin part of it, right? I'm not doing any testing on the dyes themselves. There are non-destructive ways to do that, but it's well outside of my scientific wheelhouse. So basically, I'm just looking at all of these textiles and saying, okay, they were woven plain, which means over, under, over, under. If this is your warp, which is the vertical, and this is your weft, which is the horizontal, right? And you remember when you were in arts and crafts when you were a kid, you over one thread, under the next, over, under, over. That's a plain weave without getting super sophisticated. So Indian subcontinent, all exclusively, as far as I've ever seen, Z-spun, almost exclusively cotton, although I have seen silk, and almost always single-plied with a plain weave. Now, hopefully that little crash course on some of those terms made a little bit of sense at least. And even if you don't, like, I'm never going to remember this, I wouldn't test well on this, you at least understand, like, these are the things that I'm looking for and to confirm that they're there. And if they're not, that's something different. That's something we need to look into. So that first textile that I just showed you, everything was standard. It was a Z-spin. It was plain woven, over, under, over, under. The motifs looked a little different than most Indian textiles tend to be geometric or kind of floral and abstract. when they are resist dyed and mordant dyed, which I'll explain those terms in a second, and in the earlier stages. They get more sophisticated as the centuries go on, right? But in this time period that this textile is supposedly from, you don't see a lot of like trees in the middle of your textile. So I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's a little different. Just change it up. Let's look at it. So when I started looking at it, I was like, I don't think this is cotton. Like, this very, very, very much looks like linen to me. And linen, although it can also have, you know, different lengths and odds and ends sticking out, and it can, the way they fray can sometimes look the same. I'm sure there are people out there that would say, I can tell the difference right away. But when you're looking at textiles that are 1,000 years old or more, sometimes it's not exactly clear, right? So, but as I was looking at this, I was like, there are very little extra hairs coming out, so most of it's long staple. It could be an extremely fine long staple cotton, but it's more likely, in looking at it and the colors and the way that it sort of reflected the light, I was like, I think this is linen. If it's linen, it necessarily rules it out from being of Indian origin, and then puts it somewhere in the Middle East. It could be Iran, Iraq, it could be most likely Egypt, right? So I was like, that would make sense, because some of the Egyptian motifs also tended to mimic Indian motifs, but there were definitely some distinctions, and they love to put, in my opinion, they like to put more relatable objects, so animals, architectural looking things, plants, trees, right? Those tended to be in that time period, from the best of my recollection as I'm like looking at things, right? Because I'm still cataloging everything and I haven't drawn total conclusions on everything. But as I'm looking, I'm like, this looks like it's linen, not cotton. And if it is linen, then it's definitely not Indian, it's an Egyptian. So like, oh, that could be exciting, right? We have another Egyptian, because there's much fewer Egyptian than there are Indian. So I called the curator over and I was like, hey, what do you think this fiber, or what it's made out of, looks like? And she's like, I think that's, and she didn't even understand why I was asking the question, but her first instinct was, I think that's linen. Why? Should it be linen or should it be cotton? Is it cotton? She's like, I don't think it's cotton. And I said, no. It is listed in your database as cotton, and it is listed as an Indian piece. So if it's not cotton, then that changes where it came from. She's like, well, that's very exciting. She said, well, we have textile conservators on staff who have some kind of little test. I don't know what it is. I think she said it has, like, there's a solution and it takes a few minutes and blah, 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 blah. So she said, I'm going to send this down and have, because there's enough, like, it's pretty frayed, if you can see. There's a lot going on. All these little frayed ends here and here. And she goes, there's enough we can pick off, like, one or two little fibers and it not really destroy the sort of corpora of the textile. So she's like, I'm going to send this down and get it tested. I'm like, well, that's kind of exciting. Maybe I discovered a new Egyptian textile, right? So then, while we're waiting for that, we set it off aside for the textile conservators. I'm really torn as to whether or not to show you this textile, because it needs more investigation. So I'm not going to show you the textile until I have some answers and a little bit more information. But the next textile I looked at, that was the one I just showed you, is textile number 2 of the day. So textile number 3 of yesterday, day 2, I was like, all right, well, while we're on Near Eastern stuff, or Middle Eastern stuff, I pull up this other Near Eastern textile. And it was one that I was particularly excited to see from the jump, because it is visually quite beautiful. It falls into, my opinion, my favorite category of printed textiles, which are those from Egypt, especially like between the 8th and 12th to 14th centuries. Like, I just love the aesthetics. I love the way they chose to express themselves through the textile. So I'm like, all right, while I'm at it, I'll, keep with my little vacation from looking at all the Indian subcontinent textiles, since the last one I looked at was probably not Indian. And I looked at this Near Eastern one. So I was like, huh, again, I'm pretty sure that this is linen, not cotton. Now it is listed as cotton in the database. And it is not impossible if it wasn't Egypt, if it was like Iran, Iraq, it is not impossible for it to have been cotton. But the more likely culprit is that it would be linen in the Near East and the Middle East. So I was like, okay. I said to the curator, I'm like, I hate to do this, but what do you think about this one too? She's like, oh yeah, I definitely think that one's linen too. She's like, we'll set that aside. And then she asked me a question. She goes, what do you think all these little holes are? All these holes, like, do you think it was the dye? Because some dyes are particularly destructive to textiles themselves. And so it's not unusual. And I actually had this question while I was at one of the other museums. One of the curators asked me, and I think I might have talked about this already in a vlog. The curator said, why are these parts missing? And I said, well, sometimes depending on what the dye was made of, it has something that is particularly destructive to the textile, and so over time. So she asked that question. She goes like, there's all these like little holes, but they're particularly along the black lines, because this one is not resist dyed or mordant dyed. Okay, I got to pause right here because I promised I would explain this. So block printing is where you take a block and you apply colorant to the block, and then you take that block with the colorant on it and you press it on a surface of fabric, and you transfer the ink, the dye, the colorant, whatever is on here, to the usually plain surface, right? Usually not dyed, but sometimes dyed, okay? That is block printing or direct printing. Then there's resist dye, which is where you apply a resist paste. It could be something like a wax. It could be like kind of like a gummy substance that you have to like boil away. It's something that is necessarily going to block dye from getting to your threads. And so you can apply a resist with a block. And so this is where some confusion happens. Sometimes a resist paste is applied onto a fabric with a block, or sometimes it's just freehand painted on. So when that happens, you apply the resist, you then dunk the whole textile into your vat of dye. The dye dyes all of the fabric that is available, that is like reachable, right? And then once the dye dries and they've, rinsed it out and made sure it's not going to run, then they boil away, or in some cases scrape away, but usually boil away or some other way, remove the resist, revealing the original color of the fabric. So let me show you if I go back here. So this is where resist would have been applied. It looks kind of reddish, but I promise you it's not. It's more like a creamy tan original color of either cotton or more likely linen, right? And then the dye, the red, is what actually saturated the fabric where the resist was not present. So that's resist dyeing. Mordant dyeing, which is also often done in combination with resist dyeing. I'm going to try to find an example. Here we go. Maybe not. Mordant dyeing is where you apply something called a mordant, which is like an iron or an alum or some other chemical ingredient naturally occurring to affect the color of the dye. So if you put in iron, it's going to darken it. If you put in alum, it's going to make it a little brighter, or I guess it depends on the dye stuff that you're using. But there are ways to alter the color you get from the same vat. So a mordant dyed thing, I'm trying to find you guys an example right now, sorry. A mordant dyed textile means I've applied one or more mordants onto the textile before it even reaches the dye vat. And then once it goes, here we go. Once it goes, I don't know if you'll be able to see this well. So, let's do this. Nope, I'm not being very successful. So this is darker. We've got some lighter, and we got some like dark brown looking stuff. This is all actually matter, right? It's one dye vat that when they applied multiple different mordants to achieve different colors, they were able to get different colors, one dye vat. So that's mordant dyeing. So this particular textile number 3 from yesterday that I was looking at was actually block printed, probably with lamp black. And lamp black is like the carbony soot that comes off of candles. If you were to light a candle and then put, say, a glass mirror or glass on top above it, all of the fumes would eventually leave, like that black thing. I'm sure we've all seen it on candles or whatever. If you were to scrape that stuff off and then mix it in with some gum or Arabic and some other things, you can get lamp black ink or dye. And that is the way that block printing was done in some areas. So I believe this was a lamp black block printed textile, and I'm looking at it. I'm very excited. I'm like, I think this one's linen too. I don't think it's cotton. I didn't think that was that big of a discovery. But then she says, well, like, what are all these little holes? And I said, well, it could be that there was something destructive in the dye or the ink, but let me look a little closer. And so I grabbed the microscope, and I was like, these aren't holes, like the destroyed holes. I said, these are all sewing holes, all of them. And the way you can tell is there's no tearing of the fibers. So when you sew a fabric, right, usually what happens is your needle, if you've got your crisscrosses, your needle will just basically pierce through that hole in the middle, right? It will go between the warp and the weft threads. And you can usually tell because it will push it apart a little bit further. And so they look like little round holes. It's very distinct to see that versus like, oh, I got a hole in my shirt, right? So like none of these are, well, there might have been one or two small like actual holes. I'm like, all of these are sewing holes. And there were dozens, if not 100 or 200. I mean, there were, and this was a teeny little piece like this big. And so I was like, wait a minute. And this wasn't just like to sew it onto something. This was, and then we looked at the description, it said possibly embroidered. I'm like, no. There was no embroidering because you would see more pulling at those holes, right? What it probably was, speculation. This is why I got to do some more research, and this is why I don't want to like say too much or show pictures and then have misinformation be out there. I think that maybe there were like spangles that were originally sewn onto this, or some other embellishment, not embroidery, but something to embellish this even more. Now, what was also very interesting about this piece, so it wasn't cotton, I think it's linen. It doesn't have holes of destruction, it has holes of embellishment. And then when I went to do the linen, it's always called linen count, even if it's not linen. It's just you use your linen counter as like this little thing where it gives you a little grid and you can count how many threads are there per centimeter, warp and weft, or vertical and horizontal if you can't tell. And I'm like, wait a minute. As I'm trying to, because I always try to like kind of straight, put it straight onto warp and weft. I did that backwards, warp and weft. And I'm like, this block printed image is done on the bias. Now, if you're not a textile geek, you're going to say, like, what the heck does that mean and why do I care? And why are you so excited about that? If you are a textile geek, you at least understand on the bias, which means diagonally. And it might perk your ears up because that is weird. Every single textile from every single geographic area that I have ever looked at has always been relatively straight one way or the other, right? Relatively parallel with the warp, which is the straight up and down, or if it was long ways, relatively parallel with the weft, or across the width. I have never seen a textile done at an angle. Block printed, mordant dyed, resist dyed, stenciled, gilded, none of them. Ever. I've never seen one. So the first question is like, okay, maybe that was a mistake. No. First of all, this piece was immaculately woven. The width density, or the density of the threads, was nearly identical within a very small range of margin. So the weave was beautiful. This was a master crafted woven textile. There's also, on the very end of it, some calligraphy that is akin to what you would see in a Taraz band. So this was a premium piece of work. So if you have a premium piece of work with amazingly woven textiles, a beautifully hand-carved, teeny tiny, lots of details block, they didn't screw up and do it on an angle unless there was a purpose. And that purpose, speculatively, is that it was part of a garment. That is very, very, very exciting. We know that block prints were worn as garments in China, Japan, the Middle East. We know that they were worn as garments in Europe because there are sumptuary laws prohibiting people from doing it. We don't know for sure that printed and painted were worn, textiles were worn in South America or Mesoamerica for sure, although I do have some evidence that I believe they were worn at least in North America in today United States. But almost exclusively, anywhere there are painted or printed textiles, we have evidence that they were worn. They may have been used for other things. They may have been used for other things like hangings, banners, funerary items, etc. But it is rare to find a textile where you can say this was a garment. We have, other than religious vestments, we have one textile which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London that is a child's tunic dated somewhere between the 7th and 8th century CE. There is some debate on the dating on that, so don't come for me. But I think that's what it's currently listed at. So that's the only garment. We can prove it was a garment because it's in the shape of a garment. We can see the sleeves, we can see the gussets, we can see the garb, everything. We have some other textiles where it's like, it could have been a hanging, it could possibly be. There was one that I saw at LACMA, which I think was probably a tunic. Can't prove it for sure because there's just not enough of the textile, but there's some reasons, right? But this one, I'm like, there is no reason to print on a bias unless it was part of a textile, especially when you see this thing. So I think, oh, and it was S-spun. So that means it was probably Egyptian because there is evidence of, especially the earlier you go, there's more S-spun linen. If it's S-spun, it's definitely not Indian. So it's S-spun, it's probably linen, it's got some kind of like spangles or some kind of embellishment that was done on top of it while still probably revealing the original block print underneath. And then on top of that, it's on the bias. It's like all these things about this textile make it the most exciting textile I've ever seen. And it's just beautiful. I can't wait to show you guys. But that one has also been sent down to their conservation department. So they actually went down today, day 3. It may take several days. We think that the textile conservation department will have time to do it and get us test results while I'm still here. So if it is not cotton and it is linen on the first one, great, we can change the origin. And that's fun and exciting. And that's what the whole purpose of this research is, for us to get a body of knowledge so that we can better establish the provenance of textiles. That is like literally the scope that I wrote in the grant application. So if we simultaneously and afterwards, but especially simultaneously, if we can go, No, like I've looked at 100 textiles or 150 textiles or whatever the number is by the time this month-long trip is done, and then, adding in the others. I think we're at 150 to maybe 175 textiles. Not a single one is like this, right? And in all of the writings about it, the only other person who contemporarily has written a lot about printed and painted textiles and has a good body of knowledge is Ruth Barnes. And she talks about, like, the S-twist is Egypt, but also Z-twist in Egypt as well. And that in India, it's, like, exclusively Z-twist. So it's just, like, holy cow. It's like the Holy Grail. All these things in one, right? S-twist, linen, spangles, or some kind of embellishments, and bias. I've never seen any of those things. Maybe I might have seen one or two S-twist linens, but rare. They're rare. They are really rare. So I have to look back at my notes and my spreadsheets. So that was the exciting thing about yesterday, and that's what I was referring to. And I know this video is very, very long, but I was also trying to give some explanations without just rolling through all these terms so that you could also understand kind of how exciting this stuff is and why it's such a big deal and so important. And then the other fun and exciting thing from today, which I can show you, this is day 3 of my research. I was looking at this, I don't know what to call these things. I'm sure they have a proper name. I'm going to have to look up, and I'm going to sound like an idiot right now. But for the purposes of this vlog, I'm just going to show you. Oh, you know what? I don't have a picture of it because there was no picture in the database. But I will show you a similar one in a second. So, these things. We see these a lot. They're all over in museums. And so I don't know if they're just like parts of a prayer shawl or what, but they're often cut into these one motif block. And so I saw half of one, actually. It was from the middle down. This is not the one I looked at. Okay, it's actually similar to this one. So it's similar to this, but basically it had been cut or torn. It looked like cut about halfway and then all the way down. And then at the bottom was the selvage, not in this one, but the one I was looking at, right? So, okay, big deal. Indian subcontinent, it's Z-spun, it's plain woven, it looks like it's cotton, nothing unusual there. But what I did notice was, because these are loose, so I can actually flip them over and look on the back. And on the back, there is like, it looks like either ink or the very, very dark, unfaded blue, indigo blue, that goes like this, like about quarter of an inch around the bottom, and then all the way up here, right? I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And it goes all the way up until it's cut. And then there's like all this like lint below that line, right? I'm like, well, that's very interesting. And with the lint are also like small little pieces. They almost, I don't know what it would have been in India, right? But it looked like hay, right? It looked like little teeny tiny sticks that like crumpled up. So there's like lint and like hay and like almost look like kind of roving, right? Roving is like the loose hairs before you've actually spun them. And then I realized that along this quarter-inch line, there are a few pieces of sewing thread. And I realized this was sewn, and this part right here was folded up. So this was either some kind of pillow or some kind of pouch. I don't know. I cannot tell for sure, but it definitely had a function. And when you do your wash and you turn your pockets inside out, sometimes you'll get that little lint at the bottom of that. That's literally what this was, the way the lint had actually accumulated. So cannot for sure say what its purpose was, but it is very cool to see that this piece of resist-dyed textile clearly had some other function besides garment and besides just a wall hanging or furnishing, right? So seeing these little glimpses, the teeniest little clues, one clue itself can't tell us anything, but as we start to get some more of these clues, like, well, this one had a bunch of lint and a bunch of like little, I don't know, pieces of hay or grass or dead grass or whatever it was. And then this one over here had a bunch of little sewing holes in it. So it was like, we're starting to get a little bit more knowledge about how people were using these textiles. And that is so exciting. I don't have any answers yet. I don't. And I don't know that I'll ever have answers. But what I am doing is starting to provide more pieces to the puzzle. And so that is why I was like over the moon, super excited. This video is already 35 minutes long, and if you've watched this far, thank you very much. It's like it's happening. It's happening. We're starting to like build up this knowledge, so that's exciting. I don't know if I'm gonna do a vlog on this trip where I don't cry. There you have it. 3 pieces that I am excited to see what we can learn about them. I would really love to see if somebody maybe has talked about like little pillows or maybe like a little satchel or some kind of pouch. It was certainly not pocket. Like in today's market, this would be a great jean pocket, right? But no, like we didn't have pockets at the time that these were created and used. That one's dated that one's dated the 13th century. So, and the one I looked at was very, very similar, so probably the same. So there you have it. The answer is I still don't know conclusively, definitively, what were these used for, what exactly happened, how was this made, but seeing these small glimpses, and the more of these textiles that I can continue to research, see, find information, share that information, which will be shared in more than in just this vlog. There will be publications, there will be a release of some of the raw data. I just actually have to get through the research for this research grant first. And this trip will conclude this research grant. I will be going to the Met Museum and the Brooklyn Museum and another trip sometime in the future. Those are the only other institutions that at this point I have commitments from. I can go, I've got approval. I just got to kind of work out the schedule and get them a list. But before I get to the Met and the Brooklyn Museum, the research grant time period will have ended. So I will be submitting a report back to the funder. It's not going to be like the full data report, but just like here's the conclusion, or not conclusions, here's a summary of what I did. Here are some highlights of things that we saw, found, whatever. And then over the next year is just going to be paper after paper after paper, sharing of the data, updating the Printed Textiles Project website so that some of these cool videos where you see me using the microscope up close, you can see these textiles up close. I have, trust me, a lot of video of the lint around that little pocket. I have a lot of video of the little holes of the spangles, and a lot of video of the other one where I'm looking at the elements that I feel more clearly define it as probably linen as opposed to cotton. Could be wrong, we'll find out. So that was day 2 and 3. I am working in a big glass doored room, and so people walk by and I wave, and nobody really asks me any questions, but I definitely have seen some people kind of stop and like watch the video or the screen, the monitor. Yesterday, the assistant curator had a curators meeting, and so she was in it, and I was trying to be very quiet because we're in the same room. And at one point she turns, she's like, it was her turn to talk, and she's like, well, let me tell you what we're doing here. And so she starts telling them about my research, and she's super excited about it. And she's like, I'm going to show you. Tanya, I hope you don't mind. And of course I didn't mind. And so I can see like the Zoom screen that looked like the Brady Bunch, right? Of all these curators who are all like, hi. So we showed them very quick, like a 30, 45 second, like, here's what we're doing. And I showed them how the microscope worked. And she showed them like all the textiles that were in one of the book boxes that I was working on. And she's like, we already found some super exciting stuff. And by the way, such and such textile conservator, I just sent you an email. So yeah, that's happening. So that's, that was day 2 and 3. The other 2 things that have come up or happened or begun to be discussed I want to be vague because I don't want to jinx them. So, one is a little less. One is more certain. I am going to be working with their social media and marketing department to produce some guest blogs and guest spots to help promote the museum. What that's going to look like, I don't know yet. I actually need to email her back, but I just got home and I couldn't wait to tell you guys everything. So that's that. And then the other one, there was some suggestion about classes and workshops that could be taught. That's all I'm going to say. I don't know. I don't know. Don't want to say anymore. But oh my gosh. We're seeing some cool stuff and things are happening and it's weird. This is a very long vlog, so I'm not going to go on more today. But tomorrow or the next time I make a vlog, I'm going to tell you about Dr. Florence Eli Day. Remind me. I need to tell you about her because she was a pretty magnificent woman that we discovered. We pulled the provenance on one of the items to get a little more information, and we found some very interesting information about her. This item had been donated by her, and she's kind of a mystery, and she's almost like a soul sister from a different time. I'll tell you more about it later. This is like almost 45 minutes long. Don't hate me, you guys. Sorry. So, but I'll tell you about her tomorrow or Friday. Okay. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks for putting up with my vagaries. That's the worst part about this. I have been warned many times to be careful about what I say. And this is from both people in the field and then like people that have heard bad things happening in the field. You have to be careful about what information you give. A, so that you're not misquoted. B, if the information is still like being determined, like this one where we're not sure and we are sending it away for textile conservation. Like the one that we're not sure if it's cotton or linen, great. The one that's unbiased and has some other stuff going on and I need to do a little more research and reach out to some of my contacts, that's a little bit different. That's why I haven't shown you guys that one yet. And that one might end up being a whole paper in and of itself. I have to be careful not to release information that is not confirmed. And then I also have to really be careful somebody doesn't steal my information. I kind of don't care if people steal my information because frankly, as long as the information is out there, great. But I do hope the information is put out there correctly. But I have had many people in the field say be careful about how you release this information. Control the release of the information. So that's my little apology / explanation about why sometimes I am vague about things. So I hope you forgive me. I also hope you forgive me. 43 minutes and 10 seconds long. If you made it this far, put a little 5 in the comments. 5 because you rate me 5 out of 5 stars. Okay. I'll talk to you guys later. Love you. Bye.